Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we explore the art of improving existing software with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations overcome the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robbie Russell. On this episode, Joel Hawksley, who is currently a staff software engineer at GitHub. Joel joins us from the suburbs of Boulder, Colorado in the United States. Joe Hawksley, we're so glad to have you join us on Maintainable. Welcome.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Robbie. I've been a long-time listener of the show, and it's so great to be here with you.
Well, thanks for listening. I've been a long time, what's the opposite of listener? Hosting. So it's great to meet someone that listens to the host. I don't know where I'm going with this joke. Anyhow, as you reflect on your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
Oh man, I think I actually only have one characteristic, and it comes from a seed planted by Sandy Metz at one of the, I think it was the first RailsConf I went to, like back in 14 or 15 or something like that, where she simply said that the only true measure of software quality is changeability. And I think that as I reflect on my time at GitHub, that has been the only thing that has mattered to me when I work on existing code, has been how confidently can I change it? I think about a recent episode you had with Scott Hanselman where he talked about changeability and fear. And I think that has really been a way it's definitely a way it's manifested for me in my recent work around making large-scale user interface changes at the company.
Interesting. Just for our audience, approximately how long have you been at GitHub now?
I joined in March of 2018, so it's been like 6.5 years. I did have a kid during that time, so I don't know if you discount that or not, but yeah, it's been a while.
And a pandemic. I'm curious, doing a little bit of preparation for this conversation, I know that you work a little bit more on the front end side of things. And so before we get into some of the projects and things that you've worked on there, I'm actually kind of curious, how do you currently think of what front end is as someone that's been in the industry for a number of years? And I want to hear how you think about that, how compared to how I've historically thought about it. So what do you think of as the responsibilities like a front-end developer?
I mean, I think it ultimately comes down to the experience our customers have when they interact with our web platform. And that manifests in all sorts of disciplines across the front-end spectrum of performance, of design systems, of behavior, all these aspects that are kind of intertwined. Like they aren't clean abstractions per se. There's a lot of overlap between them.
Interesting. So that would be, it's not, I'm not trying to minimize it. It's not just HTML and CSS and some JavaScript. There's a little bit more to it than that.
Sure. And I think that what has been so illuminating to me over the last couple of years especially has been that I've been working on accessibility. And what I've found is that accessibility is kind of if you tug on that thread, all the other threads move. If you truly make accessibility a priority, you have almost no choice but to consider and often improve basically every other aspect of the discipline because it is so intense, quite honestly, to pull it off well.
Can you tell me a little more about that in terms of that you've had a front row seat to some big challenges so is the case that, I'm just going to assume that the GitHub web interface, maybe just start there, maybe we at least scope it a little bit. I know they got their mobile apps and everything as well, and desktop apps probably covers all that as well. But from just thinking about looking at your repository or the tools that you have, that stuff might not have initially been built with accessibility necessarily as maybe top of mind for that initial versions of it. So if that's a safe assumption, I'm seeing you nodding there, but how does that sort of project move forward in thinking about what's the benchmark that you're going to start trying to go to make it as accessible to as wide of a audience as possible or customer base?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that was actually kind of first got involved with the project because it actually started with the Microsoft acquisition that Microsoft cares deeply about accessibility, both because it's the right thing to do and because it really has a strong impact on our ability to sell software to the world's biggest companies and governments. And so the first thing that was part of the acquisition was a recognition that our accessibility had to be better. And we approached it from what I would call maybe more of a project level kind of tack for the first couple of tries and to varying degrees of success. But over time, we realized that just wasn't going to scale to the fact that we have in our Rails monolith, we have 2,000 pages roughly. So a project-based approach isn't going to be enough.
So what does it take then?
So we have a system, or rather an engineering system of systems called fundamentals at GitHub, which is where if we care about something, we find the right way to measure it and then keep teams accountable to that measurement. So for the case of accessibility, we kind of have two sides of it. We have automation and we have some sort of like manual processes. So automation is like X scanning. We have some ERB linters. We have some ES linters that check for things that are statically verifiable. And then we also have manual audit processes that happen at least once a year for all of the key, what we call core scenarios for the entire product, where we have someone come in with assistive technology and use the application and report on any bugs. And then those get assigned severities. And the actual accountability system is around the SLAs for resolving those bugs. So if you have a Sev 1 or Sev 2, I think we have like a 30, 60, 90-day kind of system. I couldn't tell you exactly what it is at the moment. But in order for us to stay in compliance, we have to meet those SLAs. So we have a whole system for tracking whether every service in the company is requesting those audits and resolving their issues in a timely manner.
Hey listeners, it's Robbie here. It wasn't all that long ago. I'd find myself debugging a weird issue in one of our clients' Rails app. I log into one platform to track down the error, only to realize it was tied to some performance issue. And guess what? That meant hopping over into a completely different tool and trying to match things up based off of timestamps, if I was lucky. And let me tell you, my productivity didn't exactly thank me for that. Enter AppSignal, our podcast sponsor, and the tool that eliminates all that back and forth. They bring error tracking, performance monitoring, host metrics, custom metrics, uptime monitoring, and logging into one seamless platform. It's a single source of truth that helps keep your app running like a well-rehearsed symphony. Whether you're working with Ruby, Elixir, Node, Python, or tracking front-end errors in JavaScript, AppSignal has your back. They're always adding support for more languages and frameworks too. And here's the best part. AppSignal won't break the bank. Plans start at just $23 US a month. Plus, they're ISO 27001 certified and fully GDPR and HIPAA compliant, so your data is safe. Oh, and because you're a loyal Maintainable listener, you can use the promo code MAINTAINABLE at checkout for 10% off your first year. So head over to appsignal.com, tell them that your good friend Robbie from Maintainable sent you, and start making your app sing. Is it a safe assumption that with, you mentioned like 2,000 pages that are in the application, that prior to this initiative, was there a lot of discrepancy behind how vastly, were there a lot of very different patterns and approaches being used? So you couldn't just be like, this is how we're doing it now. If you just kind of use the same pattern and apply it in all these 2,000 pages, it's a 2,000 page checklist of like, let's get through all 2,000 and we've checked all the boxes, we're done. And then every year we're going to come back and audit this. Is it safe to assume that it was a little bit more complicated than that because there's a lot of deviations in how things were done based on when maybe sections or new features were added, like what's in vogue then versus what was originally available at the time, and like, let's try out this new front end related things. And so I can only imagine that being really complicated to kind of navigate.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, have you seen our code base? Are you just describing it? Because I like to tell people that we have like different vintages of front-end architecture. So like, once you've been in the code base for long enough, you can be like, okay, that was the pre-2012, vintage. And there's not a ton of that left, and then I would say that we probably have maybe a half dozen modes of having built front-end over the years that would be like fairly distinct.
And with those vintages, are there any, comparing it to wine or something, are there actually things you look back and like, oh, it felt like what we were doing in 2018 tasted a little bit better than what we started experiments with in 2020. And like the water was different, the climate was different.
Sure. I think that this being a podcast that like somewhat sits in the Rails community, I think that there are different levels of deviation from what Rails has provided for front end. For a while we were on the leading edge with something like with PJAX, before it was even a turbo links. But like we've also strayed where like we've done React in some cases in some different capacities. And I think that it kind of goes without saying, but like the further you stray from convention, the weirder things can get. And like the chances of your guess being right, I think, go down.
Are there any strategies that could help teams, thinking like how you've been in that environment for such a long time? What sort of appreciation do you have now for how things had been done and like coming into a system that's already been around for a while? Like how do you grok that and wrap your head around it and start thinking like, okay, here's a new direction forward. And I know that you've done some work with like GitHub's primer design system. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that as well. Like how do you kind of like, take stock of where we're at and then here's where we're going and then broadcast that out. I don't know how many people are working on the front end related side of things at GitHub, but I imagine it's more than a few people. So sharing sharing this information and getting everybody kind of on the same page sounds like a challenge.
It is. And so I've worked on Primer extensively. I joined the team in early 2020. I had recently created the Vue component framework. I'd worked on it for about a year before joining the Primer team. But I joined specifically because we decided that we would re-implement Primer in Vue components. We had started to build it in React at the time. And I won't go into like all the reasons for doing both of those, but you can basically boil it down to why are components good? That's why we should use, that's why we should do it. And what's been wild to me is that like, I think we've kind of been almost 5 years now. And I've gotten to see the natural, I don't want to say natural, but just like the life cycle of all those decisions. So, we started with 0 Vue components in 2019 when I introduced the framework internally. We now have like 2,000 of them or something crazy. It's a lot. And we saw all the benefits. And I think that like a lot of big technical decisions, the downsides often reveal themselves disproportionately later on the timeline. So for example, I can just give you like a concrete one. Say you have a button and you build a button component and it's great. And you go on a campaign to make everyone use your button. This is literally what we did. We said, okay, we have our button. This is how it works. This is what makes it accessible. This is what makes it the right shade of green. This is what makes it, have all these specific behaviors because we want everyone who encounters a button, no matter where it is on GitHub, to like have the same button experience. And this is kind of like a micro funny example, but like it's very true. That's something that matters deeply to us is consistency. Well, we now have very high levels of adoption. Like let's just say we're at 90%. Like 90% of our 4,000 buttons actually use the same abstraction. That's awesome until you then need to go change the button because you now have something that's used 4,000 times. And I think the thing that has really changed for me over the past year or so is seeing the other side of that adoption curve and seeing the downsides that you get from, it's like a paradox of success. Like the more successful you are as a design system, the harder it gets to change it. And I believe that's so disproportionately true on the front end. Like say we were taking this exact conversation and talking about it on the back end, and you had a class that you referenced 4,000 times. The level of complexity you'd be managing in terms of making sure that, say, you aren't unintentionally interfering with global state, or maybe there's like a runtime consideration. Oh, if I use this global class and it's deployed on a machine running, a 2 series Ruby versus a 3 series Ruby, there's a problem. Those classes of problems are 10 times worse on the front end because when you take, just say, for example, our button, well, it can be affected by what it's wrapped inside of. Someone may have been under pressure with a deadline. They might have written a CSS override or a JS override. And while we try to make sure when we're developing our components that our test cases are representative of all the use cases, when you get to our level of adoption, and also just, we get 10 billion web requests a day on GitHub. Every single aspect of that button is going to be dependent on. It's like Hiram's law to like the biggest possible logical conclusion. It just makes these things very difficult to change in practice.
Can you, just for those that don't know what this law is, could you repeat that again?
I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Hiram's law is the idea that the actual API of a thing is all of its behavior is good or bad, observed by every single person that can observe it. You might publish public API documents that say, I have 10 attributes or features of this button, but say there's a bug in Safari 3 versions ago. Well, that bug to someone might actually be something they've come to expect the behavior of in some weird workflow they have.
Do you feel like that's, you're saying that it's so disproportionate on the front end? Is it a large part about just the inherent nature of how HTML works or structured or CSS itself or the browsers? Like, what is it about that environment that seems so different than maybe on the back end? I guess maybe we can kind of control like the operating systems things are going to be running on, but maybe you can tell me a little bit more about that, how you think about that. How do you isolate that? Because I understand a lot of people are like, oh, if we use the same pattern everywhere, it'll be all of our problems are solved. But you're saying like, well, you got a whole bunch of different problems now.
So I'll give you kind of like a meta answer to that, which is, have you heard of the series of articles Falsehoods Programmers Believe About?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
So there's one that's like that you could probably guess what this is going, but one is Falsehoods Programmers Believe About Time. Another one is Falsehoods Programmers Believe About Names. And I think there might be a couple others. It's only a handful of articles someone wrote. But there is an article called UI is equal to F of state. And it talks about, I think, the 63 different dimensions or global inputs to UI rendering on the web platform. And it basically, to me, reads as falsehoods programmers believe about building front end. because there's even just like the assumption that the user will always be running JavaScript, or that a common one for us is like that the user won't be running some random browser plugin. I would guess that a quarter of the UI bugs we get reported are caused by extensions. So like all these things that, you write some Ruby code and you ship it onto you push it onto Heroku versus AWS versus whatnot. The chances of it running exactly as you intended are very, very high. Versus when you send your front end code out into the ether, there's these 63 dimensions. Some of them are more risky than others. But, for example, we ship our code all around the world. Someone might be in Australia trying to make a fetch request from a React app, and we don't have a closed data center. So like that's a different failure mode. They might be on an Android app, an Android phone that's 4 years old and performs like an 8-year-old iPhone. And no developer at GitHub is holding in our 8-year-old iPhone, let alone a 4-year-old Android phone. So we don't have visibility into that, even with like good uses of metrics.
Do you think there's hope for the front end environment at some point that like, okay, if we can just solve these few things, we will be able to make this a little bit more manageable long term? Or do you feel like this is just going to be an inherent reality of the work, the kind of work that you're doing, and we should expect more of that in the future and even more complexity?
I think that is, it depends on whether you want to be an optimist or not, right? Like having been around this stuff long enough, I think there's maybe a joke in software engineering that you can tell how long someone's been in the industry relative to their desire to just delete code constantly. When someone's been in the industry long enough, they would prefer to never write code again. They just want to get rid of code. And I think that working in design systems has given me a taste of what things could be. I think that the tricky part is that we're kind of in an uncanny valley with our use of them. So they got to be really good. They're certainly the right tool, but they got to be really good. And I think that something that's been really eye-opening to me is that even at GitHub scale, we are struggling to be able to fully fund the development of our design system to keep up with our own standards. And that's GitHub. So like if you look at all the companies that are smaller than us, if we are to say that the standard we all want to hit is similar, where does that put smaller teams? Like it's a pretty tricky place to be.
I know that a lot of companies talk about how they're building their own design systems. And so what's your kind of take on that? Do you think that you would advocate, say, a smaller if a big company like GitHub is struggling with this, would you advocate that a smaller organization spend a lot of time trying to come up with their own design system? Or what's your kind of take on that?
The single most inspiring answer in this space to me is Brad Frost's work on the idea of a global design system, or GDS, that is being floated through is it Open Web, Open UI? I forget what the initiative is. I think it's through the W3, of looking at ways of creating a higher standard, a higher shared common standard for these things. And I actually do get asked the question you just asked me quite a bit, having been in this position at GitHub. And the answer I have is your front end code on the long term, I believe, is going to cost you a lot more than your back end code, line for line. However you want to measure it, your maintenance cost is going to be, I believe now, 5 to 10 times higher than the equivalent, we'll just call it complexity on the back end. So for me, what I think that should play out for in practice for people who are building new software is trying to keep their front end complexity as low as possible to a higher degree than on the back end. And that might look like not writing any of your own components, using something off the shelf, even if you use, one of the design systems that allows you to customize it to look more like your brand. If I were starting a company again, I would not write any of my own like front-end libraries or anything.
Are there some front-end libraries that you would kind of give somewhat of a thumbs up? Like, these are the ones I'd probably I'm not saying you have to pick the best one of right now, but like, are there a couple that you're like, I kind of like what they're doing and they seem to have some long-term viability? Because like even front-end frameworks need to get upgraded at some point, or they kind of, we have clients coming to us and like, oh, we're using Vue 2, we need to migrate to Vue 3, and how do we go about that? And it's just kind of like, but they're like, well, we don't want any new features or anything, but we're afraid that we're going to fall too behind. And they're like, stuff like, it's like, feels like they're reinventing the wheel over and over and over. But what's your kind of take on that?
I know that of the people I know that look at these things, they look favorably at Radix. And there are a few others. I think Shoelace is thought of nicely from the people I know. There has been question whether we would ever consider actually adopting one of these frameworks or libraries under the hood for anything new we add to Primer, just to reduce the amount of work we're having to do. Because like maybe to take a step back, the real tragedy of all this is that, we've spent millions of dollars of engineered and consultant time making Primer accessible. And so for example, like we've really worked to like make our select panel pattern that's really complex, but a common pattern on GitHub. We've spent a lot of time making that accessible. But who does that work benefit? besides GitHub. And what I see kind of happening in the design system space is that it's all of us inventing very similar things and spending a ton of time inventing very similar things, that it's largely duplicative. And that just makes me ultimately kind of sad. And really, this is ultimately born out of the fact that we're taking a platform that was meant to display documents and we're trying to build applications with it. And I think that if we were still just building Wikipedias, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. But especially lately, GitHub is seeing a lot of market pressure from competitors that are way more app-like than we are. And I think that as the web heads more in that app-like direction, and I'm not saying all the web is, but parts of the web, maybe disproportionately the web application parts of the web head in a more app-like direction, I think that we have to be really careful about how much complexity we are taking on to build those experiences.
We'll be back with our interview with Joel in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robbie. I just want to take a quick moment to say thank you for making time to listen to the podcast. If you're finding these discussions valuable, please consider sharing a link amongst your peers and or writing a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to help spread the word or wherever people are talking about podcasts. Also, do you know someone in our industry who you think I should have on the podcast? Shoot me an email to robbie@maintainable.fm. And now, let's get back to our interview, Joel Hawksley. Having been around the industry 25-ish years and change myself, it's been interesting to see how people were able to take advantage of what the browser can do. And so the browser is it's trying to keep up with pace, and so we can build things, and HTML is a fairly affordable way to distribute tooling to people and stuff. And then it feels like, are you noticing that GitHub is experiencing some competition where things are more, air quoting, app-like or just more complex in the web interface, I'm assuming is what you're implying there? Or is it also a combination of the same technology also being used to power actual desktop applications and the mobile apps and stuff like that? And so is that part of it, that you're not just, the front-end library isn't necessarily the only exposure to that view is the web browser? It could be some web rendering within an application on a mobile device with it's getting nested a couple layers, and maybe it performs differently or behaves differently there. So yeah, maybe tell me a little bit more about that. I'm kind of curious, do you think that pressure is going to result in making it more difficult for that other goal of accessibility, if you're taking advantage of things that might not be fully accessible yet, or maybe the target audience or user base isn't the same category there?
Yeah, I can provide some high-level observations, because GitHub's architecture is not hybrid. So we have our web applications, but then we also have GitHub Desktop, which is an electronic application. It does not reuse much, if any, front-end code from any of other code bases. We have GitHub Mobile, which is native iOS and native Android. Also, very little reuse. There are some web views, but in kind of a standard, in kind of a typical hybrid fashion, I think we work to not have those be mission-critical parts of the application. GitHub has a couple key bespoke UI patterns, code diffs, the PR timeline to a certain extent, the merge box is a good example of a highly complex bespoke piece of UI. I think that what has given me some level of jealousy, though, is seeing the tooling that our true app platform peers have. If you look at what it's to build an iOS application versus building something that feels like iOS quality application for the web, the difference is vast. It's an entirely different stack, and it's a stack that was built from the ground up to build dynamic interactive applications. And I, of course, view this mainly from the accessibility lens, because that's what I've been deep in for a while. But the number of things we just have to invent for the web that exist natively and just work, say on iOS, for example, is massive. And in fact, I think that is part of the back pressure the web is facing, is that I couldn't tell you the statistic, but I have a strong feeling that the majority of user minutes on our platform are mobile. If not, we're getting close. Our mobile app is very heavily used. So all of a sudden, that is becoming the standard. So if someone's sitting around using GitHub Mobile all day on their phone or their iPad, and then they go to use our website, it will almost certainly feel like a step backwards in terms of the level of richness of that experience, in large part just because of the change in platform. And I think that if you think about the industry as a whole, I think we're going to see this pressure big time, because I think in the greater software ecosystem, the majority of user minutes are, I think I heard a 75%, 25% distribution, that 75% of technology use on phones. It's not on laptops and desktops anymore. So people, when they come back to the web, they now have the standard of, I used a native iOS app and it was all these levels of richness and dynamicness. And then they come back to the web and they're like, what the heck? Especially when it's like the same company's, platform.
That's interesting. Do you feel like that's vastly different than how you approach your day-to-day work with using the tooling? Is this a generational thing?
Oh, totally. I mean, I heard something recently that someone said that, and I felt very self-aware about this, but they said that like one of the ways that, is it Gen Z? Is Gen Z the youngest? Is Alpha is the newest generation, right?
I can't keep up. Yeah,
okay.
Maybe.
The Gen Zers and maybe Alpha folks, they can tell that they are, one of the ways they can perceive the generational divide is whether someone feels they need to go to a computer to do something. So an example of this is like if you were to ask a group of 100 people, would you use your phone to book a vacation? And if the answer is yes, you fall below into the younger generations. But if the answer is no, you fall into the older ones. Like that's kind of like a test.
I feel like recently heard like a stat that like, I don't remember what the stat was, but there was like a surprising number of students that will like write an essay on their phone.
I can't even imagine.
And my head was like, what? How do you, what? And then, or maybe a tablet.
How do you fit all your thoughts on that little screen?
No, I mean, even like doing that like on a tablet feels hard to me in my brain. So, it's funny. This is totally off topic from what I was intending to talk. Jason, I suppose. I've been debating buying a new iPad for a while. And I keep someone like, well, what's this in between my laptop and phone situation? Because I've had iPads and, you have one, looks like you're pulling one up or something. And I'm like, is it because I want to take notes differently? Looking at the Remarkable thing. And I'm like, what is it about that that's like, luring me to it? But I'm like, when am I sitting there and be like, I need something in between my phone and my laptop? It's like, I don't know how to quite explain this, but I'm like, I feel like there's somewhere in between. I don't want to go to my computer because it feels like I'm working when I want to do things that are a little bit more, maybe booking a trip or something, or being on social media or something. Maybe I don't want to be just on my phone. I don't know. Anyway, any advice for me? Should I buy an iPad?
One of my hobbies is I'm really exploring new display technologies. So I've built a bunch of things with like e-paper, and this is what I love. I'm holding up, this is a Daylight Computer DC1. It's not e-paper because it's full speed. So it's an Android tablet, which, it is what it is, but it's still black and white, and you can run Android apps on it. Like it has the Play Store, but I love it for reading and writing. So I use it as I call it my thinking computer. So I use like a little Bluetooth keyboard with it. And if I need to write an essay or an important message to someone, I pull it up, and because it's a tablet, it's single tasking and it's black and white, which means that like I have Slack and YouTube on it, and I still am able to use those as references. Or if I need to I was at RubyConf and I need to communicate with people, I could pull up in Slack. But because it's black and white, it robs them of their distracting qualities immediately. I just do not feel myself sucked in to those tools like I used to. I also have an iPad, and I use that for watching conference talks and whatnot.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. It's interesting. You might brought up the black and white or monochrome aspect. My iPhone, I have set up my thing. If I triple click it, it's the accessibility thing. But I'm like, I do that to limit the distractions when I'm exposing myself to in a weird way, outside of just using some of the time management stuff. Anyways, I remember someone showed me that maybe 5 years ago. I'm like, oh my God, I love that. It's interacting with social media is vastly different. I'm like, I don't want to hang out on social media all of a sudden, when it's in black and white. All right, let's get back on track. So, I'm thinking, accessibility, let's come back to this topic a little bit. So it's a critical part of building software that serves everyone. So do you have any advice for teams that are starting to wrap their heads around and we feel like we run it through some Excel, but there's just some websites we can run a web page URL through it and gives us some feedback, and we'll start chipping away at those items. Any advice for teams on how to maybe get that started if their team hasn't started doing that? Have they been talking about it, or maybe they feel we're kind of just scratching the surface, but where would you kind of encourage them to maybe make this a little bit more, or if there's someone listening that's this is really important to me and it doesn't feel important to the company right now, but I'd like to help be a champion for that, what sort of advice could you offer them?
Well, I would say that I've given 2 conference talks the last 2 years at RailsConf that go into kind of 2 different angles on this. One is on how you can build accessibility into your tooling, and the other one is how you can scale it. So there's the technical side and there's a political side, and you really need both. I would argue that the political side is actually more important. That's the legal, that's the financial side of things, because it is something you ultimately generally do for legal reasons. And it's also expensive. So doing it well matters mainly from a legal standpoint. That's kind of the legal test. So I've been asked this question enough over the years that I think I actually have a very succinct answer that is very actionable, which is my interpretation of all the accessibility case law is very simple. It's that you can be sued if someone who's using a screen reader cannot accomplish the key tasks that someone would do in your application. So think about like if your founder was on an elevator and was telling people the key business pitch, like the elevator pitch for the company. Make sure that someone who can use accessibility, who uses a screen reader can accomplish that goal. And that to me that's the way I see a lot of people succeeding with this is they say they're on a team that is like tangentially related to this. They might say, go to leadership and say, hey, I've been hearing about these accessibility lawsuits. Here's some frightening stats. Like just one, for example, you can use is that like 80% of the top 500 e-commerce websites in the world have had an accessibility lawsuit in the last 5 years. So 80% of e-commerce websites have had an accessibility related lawsuit in the last 5 years. Taking something like that and being like, okay, what if we were to just pick 3 user stories? Those are the 3 user stories. Sign up, pay, achieve. So I want to sign up for the service. This is literally something that we've had to make fixes on, early on. Pay, I need to be able to submit my payment information. We use a third-party card processor that's embedded in our payment flow. We had to work with them to make sure that was accessible. But that was a key thing. People have to be able to give you money. And that's actually why the e-commerce cases are so often pretty simple, because it's literally like, I just wanted to buy the damn shirt, right? Like it's not something complicated, or like in the case of Domino's, I just wanted to be able to buy a pizza, right? It's not complicated. It's not like, oh, I wanted to be able to like open a PR and like configure GitHub Actions and like all these things. It's like so cut and dry in e-commerce, which is why I think it's like such a low hanging fruit. And then of course, the other thing is achieve a key business goal. So for GitHub, we keep a list of these and we actually have end-to-end tests, which increasingly are keyboard driven, that say like, okay, using just a keyboard, I can open a pull request, observe the merge box showing my check status, and then approve it, getting a code review and merging it. So that's like kind of where I'd recommend most people start, is those kind of like key capabilities.
What about maybe a larger organization like GitHub, or in Microsoft might be a little bit differently? I know that there's projects out there where teams might be working on, say, some back office type of application where 10 people in an organization use this application a couple hours a month, but it's still an application. And I've seen some developers be like, "Why aren't we taking accessibility into consideration here?" And I'm like, "Well, what's the chance that this company is going to get sued by one of their employees?" It's like, I don't know. It's an interesting thing about like where they invest in those sorts of things, and so you'll talk to those companies and they're like, I don't think this is an issue for us. Do you know much about the law there when it comes to that sort of thing?
Well, of course, I have to say I'm not a lawyer, although one of the really fun parts about working on this project here has been that our head of accessibility is a lawyer, or is in the legal department. So that has been like, I think, a key part of our success. But so you ask about internal applications, and I think that I can give you the answer that comes to mind is that accessibility and really disability is not most people think it is. Most people think of disability as someone in a wheelchair or someone who's permanently blind. But disability, everyone will be disabled at some point in their lives. And that could be an employee that, for example, they have an eye infection and their dominant eye is they have a patch over it for a couple months, or like they have a broken arm, or all these different things where they might need an accessibility accommodation. And I could imagine that becoming tricky. Say you have a key employee and you have a piece of software that worked for them when they were injured or having a medical issue, it becoming temporarily inaccessible for them. And so there's actually a framework for this. It's called situational, temporary, and permanent. So situational is like, I have a 17-month-old boy. I do a lot of things one-handed now. So from the perspective of the technology I use, I actually have had one of my arms amputated in a lot of situations. So I have to accomplish a lot of goals with one hand that a two-handed software engineer might not think about. So that's situational. It might also be like, say you're in a loud environment. If you're in a loud environment, you are effectively deaf. You are also, in a lot of cases, effectively mute. So like you could imagine if you have a voice assistant driven application, you both can't hear you and you can't hear it, say if you're in a loud bar. So that is another situational disability. I think that when you start to look at accessibility through that lens, it really opens your eyes to the fact that it's really a UX problem, not just a like, let's serve people who are permanently, deaf or blind problem. And really, that's why I think that accessibility is such a beautiful thing in our practice, because it actually just makes us better at our craft. Like it helps us build tools that are way more usable, like universally, not just for people in these specific circumstances.
Thank you for that. That I think that just triggered some like little light bulbs in my brain there, and I don't think I had given some of those kind of consideration as much of a thought. And I think that's helpful. I'm going to go dig up your RailsConf talks and watch them, and then I'll include links to those for our listeners as well in the show notes. So definitely should check that out. So for those people listening, that might be like, okay, that's interesting. Now to talk about the political part of that within the organization, maybe they can cite some of those examples. Any other advice on like how do you kind of get some buy-in with your peers? Like, okay, great, we want to do some of this, but where do we start? You mentioned like some of the key things like sign up, those types of like achieve the task that needs to be done. What about on a technical, like how do you get through the political part of it and start thinking about some of the technical things? Like where do you start doing that on like a code level? Like where do you think that's a good place for that, for people to start thinking about?
Sure. So I think that, we've done a lot of experimentation in this space. So let me save you all a lot of trouble. What has been the most impactful for us has been ACS, which is DQ's automated accessibility scanner. That's great. But the other one that has been like mind-blowing to me has been writing keyboard-only playwright tests. Or you pick your browser driver of choice. It's been almost comical, the bugs we've caught writing keyboard-only tests. Like we've caught bugs where like we had a mouse listener. Well, if there's no mouse, the code just doesn't run. So we had stuff that was like looking for mouse events, and we literally had a regression. We wrote this test and we couldn't figure out why it wasn't working with a keyboard. Because we'd pause the test and open it in a browser, and as soon as the browser saw our cursor, the code ran because the cursor just had to be in the window. But if we left the cursor outside the window, the code never ran, and that was the bug. So most assistive technology really comes down to keyboard navigation. So if you can navigate things effectively with a keyboard, that is like a very key thing to put in your integration suite. And that's honestly where, like, if to go back to our earlier conversation about managing complexity, that is where we are at such a disadvantage on the front end. If you think about like the amount of tooling and academic research around making perfect backend code that exists, it's massive compared to making perfect front end code. It's like a desert in the front end space when it comes to, like, there's no such thing as formal verification of UI, for example. Like, if AWS wants to go build a 10.9s durable S3, they can, because there are like formal methods for verifying that their system is actually 10.9s or is of the class of 10.9s. On the front end, it's just like, it's the Wild West. We've actually had to like look at ways of inventing ways of measuring how good our UI is because it just doesn't exist.
Do you think that's going to be something that, maybe that's back to the optimistic part of it, do you foresee that becoming a thing, if becoming like web standard related type thing, or is there or do you think there's something so fundamentally different about the front end? Because culturally, is it a cultural thing where it's like, well, everybody kind of wants to think about how their interface is going to kind of be a distinguishing, not just look, but feeling, and like we don't want to be too uniform, it's interesting, like, why are cars so different, and like,
I mean, to me, that is the philosophical root of all of this. So my background is not technical. So I have a visual communication degree. I actually grew up in the field. My mom has a PhD in teaching visual communication. So she's obsessed with this stuff. And the rub of all of this is that it is somewhat antithetical to creativity. I don't want to say that they're squarely in opposition, but they are certainly competing forces. And I observe this at GitHub as really such a root cause of some of the really tricky long-term maintenance issues we have, which is that, like, you can design so fast. The difference in creative expression between Figma and us shipping it to you as a customer is several orders of magnitude of time. Like, we have designs that we've had sitting around for like 3 or 4 years that we are still aspiring to build, because like the ability to get the whole application to move in that direction is so hard. So I think that what I wonder is, as an industry, what really serves the true, almost like utilitarian needs of customers at large? When software is eating the whole world, what do we want that world to look like for the average person who is, as software engineers, we're so out of touch socioeconomically, it's wild. So like when you think about the people we're building software for, and they're having to interact with every single entity in their world through software, what do we want their net experience to be like? Do we want them to have to relearn how to use a freaking shopping cart everywhere? No, absolutely not. And that's a strong opinion I hold. I think that's actually a strong opinion I think loosely hold, but I don't think that what the world we're creating for people as software developers needs to be as varied as it is. Like, I think that there's a place for great design, but I think that it's more of a place for art than it is a place for tools. If you were to go to Home Depot and every single drill manufacturer decided they were going to make their drill completely unique and have a different interface, it'd be madness. But they're tools. They're tools for achieving jobs. So we've standardized them. And yes, there are some flourishes that make certain ones a little bit more appealing than others. Maybe others are more powerful. That might be like, okay, performance, right? I over time, I've had to really fight with my inner artist to want everything to be art, when really it's tools that we're building.
Hey folks, it's Robbie here. I want to take a moment to tell you about my company, Planet Argon. Picture us as a boutique winery for software projects, specializing in refining legacy applications into rare vintages that stand the test of time. Whether you need a little extra help with some staff augmentation, like adding a few expert hands during harvest season, or fractional development services to keep everything aging gracefully, we've got the perfect blend for your needs. We specialize in technologies like Ruby on Rails, React, and Laravel. So if you know of a company whose software feels like an uncorked bottle, aging poorly, under technical debt, or in need of fresh features, send them our way. We'll help them craft something robust, elegant, and ready to be savored. Visit us at planetargon.com. That's planetargon.com. All right, let's get back to the show. And remember, great software is all about finding the right balance. Cheers. I think that's a good place to kind of tie this whole thread together. And like, we're building tools for people. We're trying to make things a little bit easier for ourselves, and for making sure that you can also maintain these things. You can change them. And do you think that there's also this creative thing, because we're like, well, it's software, we can do whatever. But then we're also, it doesn't feel as rigid. But then there's a lot of the physical world, and these are physical things that people interface with, I suppose, because you're using a device and it just happens to be somewhat interactive. I guess it's still, I guess we're still making physical things, but it doesn't feel like it.
We don't have the physical constraints, and I think that is, if you want to get really meta, that is one of the true paradoxes of software, is that like we're beyond the traditional limits of the physical world, which means that, if you're building something physically, like if say you're, to use the previous metaphor, you're building a drill, there are many laws of physics that govern how you build that drill. In software, it's the sky's the limit. You could build the most wild interface you want. Should you? Well, there isn't like a natural thing that tells you not to, especially one of the things we deal with like on this factor for GitHub is that like we're so entrenched that a lot of people who use GitHub don't actually totally have a choice as to whether they use GitHub or not. So we don't get that feedback loop as much as we might have earlier on. If you're at a company when you're 500 developers using GitHub, whether our software works great for you or not matters less than it did before.
That's an interesting thing. Do you think there's something about early on in the life cycle of a software product, like something like a GitHub, that being a little unique and showing that creativity can kind of help bring the market to you? And then at some point, then you need to kind of accept that you're not going to be able to deviate drastically from that and keep reinventing itself over and over and over.
Yeah, it's definitely a life cycle thing. And I totally see that. And I think that what is happening is that we're trying to slow our progress in that direction at GitHub. Like we're trying to remain fun and creative and different, but it's much more of a challenge for us. And I can totally see that being a way that new companies differentiate themselves. They do build new dynamic UIs. But what I will say is that, like, at least from my observation, is that can't be at the expense of accessibility. And just from like very basic logic, the more you deviate from the norm, the less likely it is to be accessible unless you are also an accessibility expert. That is where we aspire to be at GitHub. So we are getting to the point where we are making significant progress towards our accessibility goals, and we are now aspiring to do better than just the minimum. So like our main goal to start was to just make sure that someone who's using assistive technology is unblocked using GitHub. They can accomplish the key things and we won't get in their way. But that's just the starting point. We're aspiring to get to a point where we are building user experiences that are so progressive and considerate that they lead the way and in terms of accessibility, and like make things that are truly excellent for people with assistive technology, where we aren't just unblocking them, but we're actually enabling them to do more.
That's awesome. I really appreciate you kind of diving into this stuff with us for our audience. I don't feel like I personally have spent enough time thinking about this. So this has been super valuable for me. It's interesting. My team, there's an accessibility little group in my organization. I've never joined one of their conversations. They just kind of spun up themselves and they talk about these things. And I'm looking forward to, I'm going to have to go join their next conversation and just listen in and see what they're talking about, because I might be missing out on some interesting stuff. And again, I'll share links to your talks and stuff like that as well. So thank you for hopping on and talking about this stuff. I'm curious, is there a non-technical, non-software book that you find yourself recommending to peers?
Ooh, non-technical, non-software. I feel like my wife criticizes me because I read a lot of technical software books. I mean, honestly, a recent one, I've been reading The Godfather. So good. Oh my God. I've been so obsessed with software books that one it's just been nice to be not in that world. I can think of another one though that I'm actually working on right now. And that one is, so this one's a little bit of a cop-out because it's ultimately a software book, but it's called How Buildings Learn. And this is, I don't know, I think that as a software engineer, sometimes you eventually read all books as software books, even when they aren't, because you interpret them through the lens of being a software engineer. And this one is to a T that. It basically talks about how, and gives real examples of how buildings over, say, 100 years have changed to adapt to the constraints of their environment, their owners, et cetera.
No, I like that. I'm going to definitely include links to both those for our listeners in the show notes. I'm going to have to pick that book up. I don't know why I haven't picked up The Godfather and thought about reading it. I know that was a pretty popular book at the time. I remember it always being on the bookshelf at my grandfather's house. And I'm always like, oh yeah, they made a movie about that, but I never thought to go read the book. It looked really big, but it was also just a really big book. I don't know how big the words were inside the book. Is it?
It's a fast read though. Like it intimidated me. Like I've been reading it on my Kindle and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so long. But I've been getting through it just as fast percentage wise as other books.
Nice. Well, I might check that out as well and report back, and we can have a little book club about that. Where can listeners best follow your thoughts and ruminations about software engineering online?
I post once a year on my website, hawksley.org. That's all I do. I haven't found myself to be eloquent enough to present myself well on social media, so I just don't. I write one conference talk a year, and I post like an accompanying transcript blog post of sorts that documents it.
Awesome. I'll definitely include links to that for everybody as well, and they can find you not on the socials, but maybe catch you at an upcoming conference. And with that, it's been such a delight having you join us on Maintainable, Joel. Thank you so much for stopping by to talk shop with us.
Love it. Great to be here.
Maintaining a